Thanks, Brian. That was great. We'll open up for some questions now. We've already got a couple, and I would like to ask one actually, but we'll go to the first question now. And that is, what are some concrete lessons from the early years of the American Trotskyist movement the revolutionary socialists today should learn from in operating in a time of a marginal left dominated by reformism, and how to build in the working class?
Okay, well, I suppose that I think the first lesson, which is fundamental to Trotskyism, and I think fundamental to Marxism, certainly fundamental to Marxism-Leninism, is that the revolutionary movement must be a working class movement. That is, that the working class is central. There has been a lot of talk over the course of the last, 2 or 3 decades of basically the obliteration of the working class and the rise of new social movements that displace it. What Trotskyism does is make it absolutely clear that if the working class is not central to the to a revolutionary project, then that revolutionary project will be handcuffed from the get-go. This doesn't mean that we don't learn about other mobilizations and other issues, but the questions of gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, a whole series of such issues are of fundamental importance in our time. But bringing them into connection with the working class and the working class movements is fundamental. The second question, there was a reference there to the dominance of reformists. And I think that is, absolutely clear. The revolutionary left has been in decline for a number of decades. The reformist left has been in the ascent. And I think there will have to be, in a regroupment of the revolutionary left, undoubtedly times, mobilizations, coalitions in which the revolutionary left is working with reformists and alongside reformists. And the critical role and Cannon's practice in the Socialist Party was indicative of this. The critical role that the revolutionary left has to play is to win those elements that are moving towards revolutionary politics, but overly influenced and dominated by reformists, away from the reformist cul-de-sacs, to win them towards a revolutionary perspective. And you have to thread that needle between sectarianism and opportunism to come up with a path that delimits you, differentiates you, delineates you from the sort of reformist pitfalls, but that doesn't isolate you from people who are moving towards revolutionary politics, but within a reformist sort of environment. Because people are not going to be won to revolutionary politics at the snap of a finger. You can't be isolated from them, but you can't be incorporated into that reformism as well. So that kind of what Trotsky and Cannon called delimitation in the 1930s, for instance, in the Socialist Party, was fundamental. And I think that's the key task now. And it's a very difficult task because so many revolutionary left organizations have basically imploded or have liquidated themselves into, for instance, the Democratic Party. And the task is, how to stop that process and build regroupments that then can win young people, highly differentiated groups like Black Lives Matter, win people from those kinds of mobilizations into the politics of revolutionary possibility.
Okay, I've got one for you. Now, many of us know about the fight that developed almost instantly when the SWP formed in January of 1938, culminating in what Cannon and Trotsky referred to as the split of the petty bourgeois opposition. But it seems that I've heard that the problems between Cannon on the one hand and Shachtman and Aborn on the other hand went way back almost to the beginnings of the American Trotskyist movement. Could you speak a little bit on that?
Yeah, this relates. I couldn't get into in the talk too much about the Dog Days factionalism, but that the break of Cannon and Shachtman goes back to about 1930, in fact, and the very beginnings of the Trotskyist movement. And in some ways, it gets patched up around Minneapolis in 1934 when they come together. It erupts again in the Socialist Party, where Cannon and Shachtman are on two different sides about how to orient towards the leadership of the Socialist Party. In its origins, I think it's the original antagonism of Shachtman, Aborn, and Specter towards Cannon are bred of two things. One, Cannon bore some responsibility for. In the midst of the Dog Days, he faced just a terrible time with his personal life. His partner, Rose Karstner, had a breakdown. She and he were responsible for 3 children. None of this affected Shachtman and Aborn, who were younger, had wives that worked for wages. And Cannon, you know, at the worst times in the depths of difficulties, did have a tendency to turn to the bottle. He drank too much. He basically withdrew very early in the 30s in these Dog Days difficulties from doing some of the work of the early Communist League of Opposition that as a leader was expected of him. So there was that was a very personalized kind of break, but it was compounded by the fact that Shachtman always had the inclination to be kind of to see the journalistic side of the movement predominate over the organizing side of the movement. And that fed into his tendency towards what Trotsky, in very acute criticisms of him in the early 30s, said was his tendency towards chumminess. So he went to Europe, and he actually was tasked with Trotsky by leading some of the beginnings of the International Left Organization in France and elsewhere. And Trotsky, you know, gave him documents to deliver to pre-conference organizing activities in France and elsewhere that actually singled out particular people in the French movement who were prone to cozy up to labor bureaucrats in the trade unions. These became chums of Shachtman. He actually didn't deliver the documents. He didn't do this delimitation, differentiation that I talked about. And he elided differences of politics. And that was something that Cannon didn't do. And when Cannon found out about this again, and Trotsky aligned with Cannon, it kind of smacked Shachtman down a bit. And then at the same time that was happening, Cannon was playing a forceful role in these strikes of the hotel workers, the mine workers, and the Minneapolis Teamsters. And in the Minneapolis Teamsters, Shachtman came on side because the mobilization of the workers actually brought them back together. Shachtman's best side was always when he was with Cannon. His worst side was when he broke from him, it seems to me. And then that resurfaced again, as I've said, in the Socialist Party, where, you know, Max would have liked to have spent time talking to this leading group in New York who were called the militants. It's a kind of non sequitur in some senses, and he wanted to actually stay in the Socialist Party almost forever, Shachtman, and hobnob with these basically left Social Democrats. And this is where he and Cannon came to blows again. But Trotsky put, I think, Shachtman back on the right track. And again, he aligned with Cannon around the foundation of the Socialist Workers' Party. But very interestingly, the key debate, and this isn't much known, one of the key debates in the Socialist Workers' Party's formation in 1938 was the question over whether Russia was a worker state or not. Of course, this would be the break ultimately, right, between Shachtman and Cannon later, 2 years later in 1940. But in 1938, Shachtman aligned with Cannon and with Trotsky to insist that however much it had degenerated, the Stalinist Comintern and the Soviet state was a worker state. It was James Burnham and Joe Carter, a New York Trotskyist, younger, who put forward the view in 1938 that the Soviet Union was not a workers' state. And of course, this would eventually be, the issue upon which Shachtman and Cannon broke irrevocably from one another. But the interesting tension that runs through the 1930s and the Cannon-Shachtman relationship is this oscillating relationship of, Shachtman's, working with Cannon or breaking from him. The book that I've written has an immense amount on this, great deal of detail, drawing on private correspondence and as well as public pronouncements and writings.
Thanks, boy. The questions are coming in hot and heavy now. Let's go to another one. Do you see any widening opportunities in the current landscape where revolutionary working class politics can make gains, opposed against where reformism, bourgeois supported, and ultra leftism are reaching continual dead ends?
Yeah, I mean, the current moment, however, in some senses depressing it is for those on the revolutionary left, has immense possibilities. I think that, as inchoate as its politics were, the Black Lives Matter mobilizations were basically a statement that there are young activists, white and black, who are very committed to struggling against racism, and a number of them who see not just racism as the enemy, but capitalism and its cultivation of racism as the enemy. You put that together with some militant struggles that are going on in a working class where the trade union bureaucracy has in some senses never appeared more ossified and sort of enervated. And you do see that there's a tremendous possibility for mobilization. And also, I mean, just the election that we've just lived through. I mean, and its outcome, it's disturbing that after 4 years of Trump, he would get 70 million votes. And it's disturbing that the best that the Democratic Party could do is put out someone as insipid and lackluster as Biden. But in some senses, that speaks to the sort of decrepitude of bourgeois politics. And there are elements that I think are sort of rising up. But the question is absolutely right. The difficulty is how can we regroup the revolutionary left so there is a constituency out there that is putting forward ideas and perspectives that can win people that are drawn into this sort of vacuum of the Democratic Party. Win them away from that. And you're not going to win them away from that with sort of sectarianism, but you're not going to win them away to anything positive with opportunism either. So it has always been the revolutionary left's challenge to thread that sort of needle and to interact with mobilizations in ways that win elements that are gravitating towards the left. And I would, the necessity of doing this is going to become more and more, I think, blunt and stark in the future, because I don't think we're going to come out of COVID-19 with an economy that's robust and really, moving forward by leaps and bounds. So much money has had to been pumped into basically just surviving that eventually certain chickens are going to come home to roost, and there is going to be the necessity of overt class struggle. However much Biden will be working to bury it.
Okay, we'll go to the next one. About 60 years before 1934, there were many labor strikes. Out of that period, Cannon and others were working class leaders who managed to form a revolutionary party. During the past 50 years, there hasn't been a mass movement of workers in the world. Today, there is the beginning of a mass movement protesting police brutality. And many of those who consider themselves communists embrace the policies of Mao Zedong. Do you feel that communists today should work with those who advance Stalinist politics, as Cannon entered the Socialist Party in his day?
Well, I do think that any entry has to be, I think, very clearly thought out as to what you're entering. And the Socialist Party was a mass party in the 1930s. It was, I would argue, in decline, but it was still winning elements to it that saw possibilities and saw the possibilities and importance of revolutionary struggle. The question would be, as I understand the question, would it be fruitful to enter a Stalinist party at this point? That would entail, I think, the necessity of really looking at whether that Stalinist party, how wedded it was to Stalinism, whether it had growth possibilities, or whether it was simply, something of a carcass. Now, even if it is a carcass, there could be significant elements within it that could be won away from the politics of Stalinism. Whether, that's possible or not, you'd have to really discuss it in terms of the particular political formation in question. I mean, the question that was asked referenced Maoism and Stalinism. I mean, there are, different, but on a larger question, not of entry so much, but of whether united front activities are possible, that I think is certainly very much on the agenda and necessary. And through united front activities, you will see whether, both what the mass base and the leadership component of these kind of particular political formations is, and whether there is an opportunity for work. But I think you have to take it on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, we're going to go to Another one on the Q&A, then I'm going to jump over to one that's on the chat. This one, is entryism relevant today when it comes to reaching the rank and file of other groups? Under what conditions does entryism offer a more effective approach than United Front action?
Well, again, I do think you'd have to look at this on a case-by-case basis. I would say that rebuilding, and this has to be done, rebuilding United Front activity strikes me as the beginning now in our times. In part because, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't see a mass party out there that you could effectively enter. I don't consider, for instance, the Democratic Party to be a party that an entry can be conducted in. And I don't think just going into the Democratic Party is a great idea. But building United Front activities across the spectrum of what's left of the small organized left in the United States strikes me as fundamental. And in building those United Front activities and becoming a presence in mobilizations, even like Black Lives Matter, would be an opportunity to see just where the, what the lay of the land was, what the possibilities for recruitment were. Entryism I see as a, as less of an option right now, given the state of the left. I mean, in order for entryism to be on the agenda right now, you have to have a significant enough left group. I mean, when Cannon and others entered the Socialist Party, they were a significant group with a fairly coherent political program and perspective and orientation. I don't see that many groups that are at that level right now. United Front groups, United Front activities, regroupment, successful regroupments could build such something of that nature. Then the question is there a mass organization of the left sufficiently significant that you'd want to enter into it? I mean, I don't consider, for instance, that you're going to get much out of entering the Labour Party in Britain right now. I mean, given what the Labour Party is, I just don't see that. I don't see that much in the United States or Canada. My own perspective is different than some in Canada. I don't see entering the NDP as a project for the revolutionary left. I think when you do, you're too small, you're too weak. The other party is too far removed from revolutionary politics. Doesn't mean you can't do United Front work, but entry right now requires, I think, those two sides to be very seriously considered.
Well, I'm telling you, there is so many great questions coming in. I'm hoping we can get to as many as possible. Let's go. I was going to go to the one on the chat. And thanks to Bryan, says, for the incredibly engaging talk. I'm wondering if he can discuss how the Trotskyists, the SWP, mobilized against fascism, especially during the post-war reaction and McCarthyism. Good one.
Okay, well, that's I'm a little less comfortable talking about that because while the research for that is done, I haven't really assimilated it all. I think the struggle against McCarthyism again produced factional splits and sort of breaks in the Socialist Workers' Party. I mean, some of you may know that a group called there was a break in 1953-54 of a significant sector of very talented and able trade union organizers and others around a guy named Bert Cochran, who ended up splitting from the Socialist Workers' Party in 53-54. Harry Braverman was part of this group, the guy who later worked for Monthly Review and wrote the important book Labor and Monopoly Capital. And that split was really over how do we function as a revolutionary group in the age of McCarthyism. And the Cochranites wanted to essentially, they were for more alignment with the Stalinist Communist Party. They were for less of an independent revolutionary Trotskyist organization. They were for more trying to appeal to a mass progressive base. They started a magazine called American Socialist, which lasted about 4 years in the 50s. But their orientation was to, in a very crude reductionist kind of characterization, which I'm, forced into right now. Their orientation was more to back away from building the Revolutionary Party and more towards being a left current that intersected with mass struggles and tried to, essentially tilt the deck of class relations in a more left-wing and progressive manner. I don't think that's what's on the agenda now. From my own perspective, too much of that already exists in the left, and we see that all the time. As to how they fought fascism, well, I think that their fight against fascism was throughout the 30s and 40s was premised on building united fronts against fascism, both internationally and in terms of the US. And in terms of the 30s, this meant also being part of labor defense guards that were prepared to thwart fascist incursions in the trade union movement. This was part of what went on in the Minneapolis Teamsters Union. They formed basically a defense guard against the threat of fascism. But the whole struggle of the American Trotskyist movement against fascism was, acutely curtailed by the way in which the American state moved decisively against the Trotskyists in 1940-41, where they were brought up on Smith Act charges of treason because of their critique of the war as a capitalist war. And 18 of those revolutionary Trotskyists, including the bulk of the leadership of the Minneapolis Teamsters, were actually brought up on these Smith Act charges, along with Cannon and others, and served jail sentences under the Smith Act in they went to jail in the mid-40s. And this was an incredibly difficult time for the Trotskyists. This smashed the role, their leading revolutionary role in the trade union, in the Teamsters union. It put them on the defensive. They again were faced with the opposition of the Communist Party, where basically Browder and the Communist Party provided the state with evidence that these were, the Trotskyists were so-called a revolutionary fifth column within the United States, and that they needed to be, the communists supported the Trotskyists being jailed under the Smith Act, and provided evidence to the state, which was nothing more than quotes from Marx and Engels and Lenin on revolutionary politics. Of course, once they jailed the Trotskyists, they then turned in 1949 under McCarthyism to jail some of the communists, which was a very sad moment for the left. But I think in terms of fighting fascism, the key Trotskyist contribution is the absolute necessity of putting aside all organizational fetishisms and building united fronts that can actually mobilize the established groups on the left, but also all other forces that are interested in, basically defeating fascism. And I think that is a lesson that could well be applied to, the necessary mobilizations against police repression and the slaughter of blacks that it's been an ongoing part of American history, whether it be under slavery or under Reconstruction and lynching, or under the Klan, or under the police and vigilante forces in more modern times.
We've got so many questions coming in. I'm going to try this. Okay, we got two different questions. No, not two different questions. Two similar questions from two different attendees concerning the SP. From one, the question is, can you discuss Cannon's specific intervention into the SP, and how did the Trotskyists raise their ideas in the SP? And along with that, what, if any, lessons do you think we can learn from Cannon et al.'s work in and with the 30s SP regarding how Trotskyists should relate to or interact with present-day organizations like the DSA? So we got, I turned it into a two-part question. How did the Trotskyists raise their ideas in the SP, and what do you think it would be the present day, or what they would do in present day organizations like the DSA?
Yeah, well, as I said, I think that the entry into the SP was bifurcated, and Cannon was alone in his practice and his perspective, which grew and evolved and developed over time. But his perspective was, forget about hobnobbing with the leadership of the SP. Forget about, conferring with or setting up newspapers with the established centrist leadership, however left-wing it may appear. Instead, what we need to do is go into the Socialist Party across the country, and everywhere that it exists, and we need to work in the Socialist Party and its and its mobilizations, and we need to build them, and we need to show the SP members on the ground that we are the best SPers, that we will work the hardest, that we will actually develop the most clear and coherent revolutionary programmatic perspective, and that we will put our wheels to the grindstone in order to get new recruits to the movement, all the while doing so on the basis of our ideas, our politics, our program. We will start newspapers like the Labor Action. We will cultivate relations with trade unions. We will develop, through that process, a critique of not only the the employers and the state, but also of the Communist Party and other groups on the left that we think have mistaken policies and they're leading workers astray. But we will do so in a comradely and building fashion rather than any kind of tearing down. That was Cannon's perspective. He did that. He literally came very close to taking over the Socialist Party in California when he was out there in San Francisco and LA working with the Siemens Union, building this newspaper labor action and stumping up and down the coast for the cause of the Socialist Party. To again be somewhat crudely reductionist, in New York City, almost all of the Trotskyists who remained there, including Cannon's old ally Arnie Swabach, thought that the main route that Trotskyists should engage in working in the Socialist Party was to engage in discussions with and an ultimate alliance with the left wing, as they defined it, leadership of the Socialist Party. So, Cannon really went on the agitational road. Shachtman and company tended to be ensconced with, the Barron brothers and Jack Altman and others who were the kind of a layer beneath Norman Thomas in New York City. Well, I think Cannon's perspective, if you're going now in an entry is different than United Front work, but perhaps there's parallels too with how you work. I mean, you have to have United Front work has to be, in some senses, leadership to leadership. But in the actual building of the United Front, you can show, while aligning with the leadership around a single, decisive issue, you can show when you build that United Front, you can show the rank and file in other organizations, or you can show individuals that are rallying around it. Like a group like Black Lives Matter is a very amorphous group, right? I mean, it's drawing people into it. You can show those people who get drawn into it that you have a program, you have a perspective, but you also build that movement. And that's what's pivotal, I think, is not to concentrate only on discussions with leaders and trying to win leaders, win yourself a place of favor among the leadership. Now, how one works with the DSA, well, I guess that I think I've answered that to the best of my possibilities. I mean, I'm not working in the United States, and I'm not, active in anything where, developments with the DSA are central. But I would think that if you're orienting towards the DSA, then a fundamental point would be not to get to basically build United Front actions around single issue campaigns that you can show people in the DSA that perhaps that you can build the movement around the specific campaign, whatever it might be, but not to lose sight of the politics, which are always going to be, it seems to me, they have to be separate from the Democratic Party as a whole, and you can't get lost in the sort of morass of the Democratic Party and its electoralism. I mean, this is, I do think that those who are in the DSA and really bank their all on Sanders and then find themselves now backing Biden, they're going to find that Biden is going to move against them. Biden is going to move to crush the left in the Democratic Party. And if you're outside of that in another group, you may have cause to work with the DSA in terms of, a Black Lives Matter mobilization, a mobilization around how to fight COVID-19, a mobilization about, on trade union questions, a mobilization to, for instance, defend Roe v. Wade and the right to choose. gay rights. You know, there's all kinds of issues that one can see that one would work with people in the DSA. But, you know, and at some point, while the Democratic Party hierarchy will be on side with some of these issues, on other issues, it may not be. And you need to keep that differentiation very clear.
Let's skip to this one here. From an anonymous attendee, I understand that many of those who left with Shachtman did come from the Socialist Party entry. What were some of the difficulties in bringing the new members from the SP to revolutionary politics? Do you have a sense of how many from the SP ended up staying in the SWP after the split in 1940?
Yeah, I think after the entry, the actual size of the Socialist Workers' was probably in the late 30s, was probably in the order of 1,500 to 1,800 people. It's often been underestimated and estimated to be lower than that. But my kind of sense is that George Brightman's work on that, and you know, in his papers he has some figures. I think at 1,500 to 1,800 would probably be about the number. Shachtman took a significant number of people with him with the split in 1940. And a number of those were Socialist Party youth elements. And some of them, you know, very impressive figures like Hal Draper, whose contribution was quite significant in later years. A number, however, you know, not all of the Socialist Party youth went with Shachtman. Some stayed with Cannon, and Cannon did tend to keep with him more of the revolutionary trade union wing of the, and those trade unionists who came into the Socialist Party, of which there were a number. But of the Socialist Party recruits to Trotskyism, you know, after the entry, I think the best estimate that I can come up with is about half of them went with Shachtman and half of them stayed with Cannon. And while more youth went with Shachtman, it was not a question of all youth went with Shachtman. So it's differentiated and it's complex.
Okay, how about this one? Given that Cannon and his comrades who were expelled from the CP tried to organize the CLA, Communist League of America, around Trotsky's international program, how would you characterize the American left opposition's role in the political development of left opposition globally in the early 30s, beyond just the tactic of entryism?
Well, I think that, you know, the entire international left opposition, which really is I mean, the CLA is formed before the international left opposition is actually formed. It doesn't mean that it preceded it. It just means that organizationally, the ILO wasn't actually constituted until after the CLA was. That said, the entire left opposition forces in the very early 30s, for a variety of reasons, including some that I talked about at the beginning of the talk, how difficult it was. This was a very small and marginalized grouping. But by the time of you know, the mid 30s, and particularly after 1933-34 and the Minneapolis strikes, globally, the American left opposition was the largest national section of the international Trotskyist movement in the left opposition. And you would have to say that its activities in the trade unions The hotel strike was one reflection of this, but the Minneapolis Teamster strike was the greatest articulation of it. They had more influence there than they did in any other national section that I know of. And as I said, it was the Trotskyist practice in the Minneapolis Teamsters Union that really was the basis for Trotsky's development of his discussion of trade union questions in the transitional program, which he later put together in the 1930s. And it was discussions with Shackman, Vincent Ray Dunn, Rose Carstner, Cannon, and I think one or two others in Mexico City in 1936 that actually provided Trotsky with a lot of what he put together in the transitional program on these questions. So, and the American movement, for instance, played a fundamental role in publishing Trotsky's works in English. They did even in the early 1930s. They translated and published a number of Trotsky's works. They played, and that was of pivotal importance in getting the ideas of Trotsky out to an audience, not just in the United States and Canada, but in England and other places where English was spoken. The Trotskyist movement in the United States was the decisive movement that defended Trotsky from the slanders and the calumnies of the Moscow trials, and that set up the Dewey Commission, which met in Mexico City, where Trotsky delivered 6 or 7 days of testimony, and where the transcript of that testimony became major documents of repudiation of the allegations that came out of the Moscow trials in 36, 37. The Trotskyist movement played a very important role in critiquing Stalinist practices during the Spanish Civil War, and some Trotskyists went over. The Communist Party, of course, sent far more people in its international brigades, but there were Trotskyists that fought in the brigades and fought with the POUM and others in the Spanish Civil War. So it's impossible to underestimate, I think, the role of the American national section of the international left opposition in the 30s. It was the leading section, there's no doubt. And Cannon played a role in trying to regroup a very fragmented European and particularly British section of the Trotskyist movement. He was never quite as effective as that as one might hope, as people would have hoped for, but he did bring together various factionalized and even warring sections of the international left opposition in Britain. He was the one responsible for, in part, for bringing C.L.R. James from Britain to work in the American Trotskyist movement and the SWP in the late 30s, where James, played a fundamental role in the black movement. And the Trotskyist movement also played a very important role, I think, in raising the first left revolutionary criticisms of the policy of the Comintern towards blacks in the United States and the Black Belt Nation thesis, which was, I think, a deeply flawed perspective, and it's one that all elements within the Communist League of America criticized and came to criticize against Trotsky to some extent, who still thought of blacks as a you know, as a nation in the U.S. and wondered about he just didn't know enough about them to appreciate that blacks were so integrated into the American nation at the same time that they were a racially oppressed and you know, viciously attacked grouping. But it wasn't just Shachtman, it was Cannon and particularly Hugo Oler who played a role in critiquing the Black Belt Nation thesis in 1933-34 and developing an approach to the struggle for revolutionary equality, which resonated with you know, some blacks. The problem was that the Trotskyists were too small, I think, to really you know, put forward their politics on this question in an effective way.
Well, this has been great. I think we got to a lot of the questions, but time marches on, and time is not our friend in this case. So, at this point, we're going to end the webinar after an hour and a half, and much thanks to Bryan, and looking forward to getting that second volume out and getting into my hands anyway. What do you think, John?
Well, thank everybody who came, and thank Bryan once again for speaking. It was extremely illuminating for me, and I appreciated it, and especially in these times when we're trying to sort out these questions of regroupment and building revolutionary movements and building united fronts. It was a very informative talk. I want to thank you again for coming.
Well, thanks very much to Socialist Resurgence and everybody who participated. I wish I was there to talk to a grouping, but this is what we do in these times, and I much appreciate you putting it together.